Is it worth it? That's the question running through the man's mind as he tries his best to chomp down on his breakfast. It's the crack of dawn, but he's up early. He has to be up early because he has to get his breakfast down him, because he's going to need all the energy he can get for the big race in a few hours' time. And everything has been leading up to this one point. All the runs in the pouring rain, all the sessions in the gym, all the late nights that he's had to say no to, all the watching of what he eats, it all leads up to this. And the question is it worth it? It's the same question that a student might ask as she comes to her final exams. And she's spent all those years slogging over the books. She's spent all that time in the library. She has put in all of that hard work for essays and for assignments. And so she asks the question, is it worth it? And in both cases, the answer is yes. As the runner crosses the finish line and as he gets handed his medal, he starts to see those early morning runs in a very different light. And as the student goes up onto the stage and as she puts on her graduation gown and as she gets her certificate, she starts to get a whole new perspective on the essays and the revision and the lectures that she has been going through. A whole new perspective. And this morning, I want us to see a whole new perspective on Isaiah chapter 53. Because we're coming to the finish line. Now, you might remember at the very start of our studies on this passage, I pointed out that it is made up of 5 different sections. And each section is made up of 3 different verses. And if you were to just look at your Bible, you will see, even from the way the paragraphs are broken up, that's the 5 sections right there. It's really obvious from the way that it's set out. Well, this morning, we're coming to section number 5. We're not quite crossing the finish line yet, but we are on the last lap. And so far, it's been a real slog. Hope you don't feel that way about the servants. I don't think Mark does, I certainly don't. But for the servant, it's been a massive ordeal. He has had to face the sort of suffering that we can't even begin to imagine in our heads. And you just think of some of the words up here behind me, some of the words that have been used to describe the experience of the servant. Despised, rejected, disfigured, sorrows, suffering, stricken, smitten, afflicted, crushed, cut off. It's been an ordeal. And even this morning, as we reach verse 10, and as we reach the final lap, as we get towards the finish, even in this verse, we have yet another description of his suffering, don't we? Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And so this servant, he's had to make unbelievable sacrifices, hasn't he? And I mean that metaphorically. He's had to suffer, but I also mean it literally. Because again, notice verse 10, and though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, his sacrifice has been immense. And so the question is it worth it? Is it worth it? And today's verse, and then next week's verse, and then the final verse, they're going to show us that absolutely yes, it has been worth everything that the servant has suffered. Because what we see in these final 3 verses is the servant's reward for his labour. And this morning I want us to see 3 results of the servant's work and the servant's suffering. And really, you see them right here. They're just right here in the verse. 3 results. The first thing, wrong verse, up here, offspring. First result of the servant's suffering is offspring. Now, I don't know if you can remember back to doing history at school. I can remember back at least to some of the history that I did at school, and certainly in the school that I went to, we spent a lot of time learning about different kings and queens. And there was always so much drama whenever it came to kings and queens. And one of the reasons for drama was there was a constant obsession with offspring. So if you're a king, you really, really want to have a son, because you want someone who you can pass the kingdom on to whenever you're gone. And there was always so much drama over this. So maybe you had one king, and he and the queen, they weren't able to have any children at all. And so whenever the king died, the throne was going to pass to somebody else. It was going to go to an uncle or to a brother or to something like this. And in a sense, it would pass outside of the immediate family. Or maybe you had another king, and he had children, but he only had daughters. And that's okay. The throne can maybe get passed down to one of the daughters, but she's maybe going to get married. She's going to join another family. And so the throne is going to go outside the family line. And then sometimes you even had drama when the king did have a son, but there was this constant nagging thought, what if something happens to him? And so the king really wants to have not just an heir, but also a spare. There was always so much drama. It was so important that you continue on the family line. And in history, this hasn't just been the case with kings and queens. This is the way that ordinary people have also viewed things as well. And whenever Isaiah was written, the whole idea of continuing on the family line, this was a really big deal. And to illustrate that, I want you to just think for a moment of the Old Testament and just think of many of the stories in the Old Testament where continuing on the family line is a really big theme of the story. So you think, for example, what about Sarah? Abraham's wife, Sarah. Do you remember? She suggests that Abraham sleep with one of his servants in order to continue on the family line. Or do you remember Lot's daughters and what they did with their father in order to have offspring? Or think of someone like Rachel or Hannah, who were absolutely distraught because they thought that their line was going to be snuffed out before it ever began. Or even think of the story of Ruth. And think of how the whole idea of continuing on the family line is constantly in the background of the book of Ruth. Offspring was incredibly important in those days. And then you could add to that how in the Old Testament, God's covenants were extremely central. And you think of the covenant promises that God made. Think of what he promised to Abraham, for example. I will make your offspring like the sand on the seashore and the stars in heaven. And so offspring, in a sense, in the Jewish Old Testament mind, offspring was a big part of the incredible blessing that God poured out on his covenant people. It was so, so important. And then along came a man. He was a single man. He never got married. He never had kids. He never did anything to continue on the family line. And he died. An absolute waste. Because now nothing that he has done is going to endure. There's no one to carry on his name. Except, wait a minute. He will see his offspring. He will see his offspring. Jesus did not have physical offspring. But Jesus has got more spiritual descendants than it's possible to count. In fact, that is the ultimate fulfillment of what God promised to Abraham. The ultimate fulfillment is not all of the Jewish people who are able to trace their DNA back up to Abraham. The ultimate fulfillment of what God promised to Abraham is the spiritual descendants, the offspring of his offspring, the servant. And here we are this morning. You can look around you. What do you see? You see proof of God's faithfulness to his covenant. And as you look around this room, you see proof of the fact that Jesus' sacrifice was worth it. Because you see his offspring. You see his descendants. We are his descendants. We are those who carry on the family name. We are those who continue the family business. That's us. And that means we've got a big responsibility. We have the responsibility of living up to the family name. We have the responsibility of following in the servant's footsteps. We have the responsibility of making sacrifices for other people. But as well as a big responsibility, we've got a massive privilege. Because here is how precious and how beloved we are in Jesus' sight. We are his offspring. I like how one writer put it. He says, verse 6, see if I can find verse 6. You can never find it whenever you're looking for it, can you? But in verse 6, we stray like sheep. In verse 10, we come back as children. Thanks, Olivia, right there. We stray like sheep, and we then return as children. That is who we are in the sight of Jesus. That's how special you are if you're one of his people. And so the question is the suffering and is the sacrifice of Jesus worth it? Well, Jesus looks at this room this morning. He looks at you, he looks at me, and he says, yes, it was. So, first result of Jesus' suffering, he will see his offspring. Second reason why his suffering is worth it, he will prolong his days. He will prolong his days. Without doing the math, anyone want to have a guess? The average human lifespan, how long is it in days? 6,000, says Olivia. You're quite far off, actually. It's 30,000 days, but you were brave enough to have a guess, and that's good. 30,000 days. I don't know how you feel about that. 30,000 days. And I strongly suspect, the older you are, the smaller that number seems. But 30,000 days, that's the average human lifespan. Not for Jesus, though. Jesus lived for around about 12,000 days. And by the time Jesus came onto the scene, by the time he began his ministry, he had around about 1,000 days left. And then he was cut down in his prime. He was nailed to the cross. He breathed his last. And if you want to imagine it this way, as he breathed his last, the counter went down to 0. No days left. They're all gone. Except he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Do you remember a number of weeks ago, whenever we began with chapter 1, I told you the story of Rich Gantz. And Rich Gantz grew up in a Jewish home. He had a real crisis of faith. He became an atheist, yet he still considered himself to be Jewish. That was his heritage. That was who he was. But do you remember I told you that he had met a Christian, and the Christian asked him if he would be okay if he could maybe read a passage to him or read something to him. And Rich said that's okay. This Christian man, though, he didn't tell Rich he was reading from the Old Testament. And the passage he read from was Isaiah chapter 53. And as he read from the passage, Rich is thinking to himself, couldn't be more obvious, this is speaking about Jesus. Has to be Jesus. He just assumed this is some sort of Christian writing. This is Christian propaganda. That's how he saw it. This is something that was written after Jesus' death and it's designed to sort of put a positive spin onto Jesus' death. It's designed to sort of explain away what happened at the cross. But you remember, Rich got quite agitated by some of the phrases. He was really quite offended, actually, by some of them. And there was one line, and I think this might be the line that more than any other really took Rich to town. And it's this one. He will see his offspring and prolong his days. And Rich knew that this had to be a reference to the resurrection. Couldn't be anything else. It has to be a reference to the resurrection. And that's ridiculous, because when you're dead, you're dead. Why can't people just accept this? And it was only then, do you remember, whenever the man finished reading and he turned the book around and Rich saw it's the book of Isaiah that he's reading from. And he knew this was written 700 years before Jesus. It's only at that point that Rich actually came to believe in Jesus. But Rich was absolutely sure it's a reference to the resurrection. He will prolong his days. And it's really striking whenever you consider what we've already seen in the passage so far. So this is the one. I'll not try and find it now. There's just too many pages there. But he was cut off from the land of the living, wasn't he? Thousands of days of his life snatched away. 18,000 days of a normal human lifespan that he didn't get to live, snatched away from him. And yet he will prolong his days. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. He died and he was buried. He was assigned a grave with the wicked. I mean, that's as final as it gets. He's dead and he's buried, but not for Jesus. And here is the promise, hundreds of years before Jesus even came into the world. Here is the promise that Jesus would rise from the grave and he would prolong his days. So the question is it worth it? Everything that Jesus went through, is it worth it? Well, yes, it is. Because he will prolong his days. So we've seen he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days. The third reason why it's worth it, the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. I was reading about Apple the other day, by which I mean the company, the computer company. Apple, as you may know, was co-founded by Steve Jobs in the 1970s. Steve Jobs, if you know anything about him, you'll know he's a man with incredible vision, and he had this real vision for the company. What some of you might not be aware of is that in the 1980s, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company that he had co-founded. And the man who ended up running the show was called John Sculley. Now, Sculley and Jobs, they saw things very differently. Now, I realize you might be thinking, wait a minute, I can remember Steve Jobs, with the iPod and the iPhone, and that's a lot more recent than that. Steve Jobs came back eventually, but from sort of the mid-80s to the mid-90s, it was John Sculley who was really running the show at Apple. And it was a bit of a disaster. Just the company really went downhill. Now, I realize that what I've read could be an oversimplification, and I realize that there's always two sides to every story, so we do want to bear that in mind. But what people would say is Sculley just did not understand the vision of Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs, he was a man who was all about innovation and about perfection. Whereas John Sculley, he was a man who was all about revenue. And the two didn't really entirely fit together. And if we wanted to put it like this, we could say the will of Steve Jobs did not prosper in John Sculley's hand. And sometimes that can be what happens in the world of business or in other areas too. If you have a vision and you pass it on to someone else to execute that vision, it can be a very dangerous thing because things can very easily go pear-shaped. But what about God's vision for the world? What about God's vision for humanity? What about God's master plan for salvation? Is there someone that he can entrust that plan to? Is there someone he can trust to take it and run with it and see it through? And the answer, of course, is yes. The servant who acts wisely. And when you stop to think about it, the will of the Lord has certainly prospered in Jesus' hand, hasn't it? What was the will of the Lord? Well, it's the will of the Lord to save many. It's the will of the Lord to save men and women and boys and girls from every language, every tribe, every country, every culture in the whole world. It's the will of the Lord to save those who are most hopelessly lost, with no chance of ever returning again. It's the will of the Lord to save those who are decent and respectable, but they're too proud and too complacent to realize the danger that they're in. It was the will of the Lord to save completely, not to do half a job and then to leave his people to do the rest themselves. No, it was his will to do it completely. It's the will of the Lord to save eternally, to save his people in such a way that no matter what, they will never lose their salvation. It's a bold vision. Has Jesus been able to see it through? And the answer, of course, is yes, he has. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. And actually, that's even more staggering when we consider what the will of the Lord actually involved. What does the start of verse 10 say? Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. Well, he certainly suffered. And yet, what did Jesus pray in Gethsemane? As the suffering was starting to pour over him, what did he pray? He prayed, not my will, but yours be done. The will of the Lord prospered in his hand. What a Savior. What a servant. And he is still causing the will of the Lord to prosper. Because the will of the Lord is not simply about stuff that's in the past. The will of the Lord is about the present, and it's about the future as well. So what is the will of the Lord for today? Well, it's the will of the Lord to lead sinners to salvation. It's the will of the Lord to build his church. It's the will of the Lord to shape us and mold us and make us more like himself. And Jesus is still doing that through the ministry of his Holy Spirit. And sometimes we can struggle with discouragement, can't we? We don't see progress in these areas as quickly as we would like to see it. Here's the promise to encourage us. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. It's been quite a journey so far, Isaiah 53. Not quite done yet, but we are in the last lap. For Jesus, the big question is it worth it? For you and me, it's the same question. Is it worth putting all of our eggs in the servant's basket? Is it worth trusting Jesus with everything that we've got? Is it worth following in his footsteps by faith and making sacrifices of our own? And the answer is yes. Because at long last, we see the success of the servant. He will see his offspring and prolong his days. and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand.